The muscle on my left side was built by carbohydrates. The muscle on my right side was built by the ketogenic protocol. Can you tell which side's slightly bigger? 6 in one, half a dozen in the other. Really. Okay, I do know that you can build muscle with a ketogenic diet. I have done it myself. I've seen thousands of people do it. But I also completely understand the argument surrounding needing carbs to build muscle. Now, that argument comes from something that's called IGF-1, insulin growth factor 1. Now, IGF-1, which we'll explain in a little bit more detail, is really just related to the signaling that insulin provides, somewhat intertwined with growth hormone, to ultimately allow our muscle to grow. So people that do the ketogenic diet sometimes get nervous because they see content out there saying you cannot build muscle with a ketogenic diet. Well, there's a lot of other reasons why you can build muscle with a ketogenic diet that are independent of IGF-1. Okay, let's break it down. Oh, and after this video, check out Thrive Market. Whether you are doing keto or not, they are just a tremendous source of getting groceries delivered to your doorstep. So like all your pantry staples, a lot of times much more cost effective than the grocery store. Plus, if you use that link down below, there is a special gift when you use that link and sign up for Thrive Market. So they're a membership-based online grocery store. So like my pantry staples, they just get delivered to my doorstep. Or if I'm traveling, like if I go down to stay at an Airbnb somewhere, if I'm traveling somewhere for work, I will just literally log on and order a box to show up there when I'm there. That way I don't have to be dependent on a Whole Foods. I don't have to be dependent on a Trader Joe's. I can just know what's there. So it's super convenient, and I have my specific fasting bundles, keto bundles, you name it. So use that link down below in the description, and thank you, Thrive Market, for the continued support of this channel. So let's start this off with a study. The journal of Strength and Conditioning Research published a study that took a look at subjects for 10 weeks. Now, these subjects were on either a standard Western diet or they were on a ketogenic protocol. And they had them resistance train and do their usual thing. Okay, calories were the same, yada, yada. Now, at the end of 10 weeks, there were some interesting results. Okay, they found that the low-carb ketogenic group lost a lot more fat, but the carbohydrate group, the Western diet, had built a little bit more muscle, but they didn't lose as much fat. Okay, but both groups had the same increases in strength and power. Okay, we'll talk about that in a second. But only the ketogenic group had an increase in testosterone. Now, if we were to believe everything that the bro science tells us, that would lead us to believe that because testosterone levels are higher, they're magically going to build more muscle because testosterone is the end-all be-all, right? No, it's not. Clearly, insulin signaling plays a role. Clearly, inflammation plays a role. And yes, testosterone and dihydrate testosterone, DHT, play a role. The thing that I liked about this study was that it kind of proved that, right? Okay, even though there was slightly more short-term muscle built with the carbohydrate group, the testosterone, which implies a longer-term muscle building strategy, was higher in the keto group. But the most important thing that I recognize here is that strength and power were equal, which means that contractile force, the contractile tissue, was just improving just as much. So which means that with strength comes some mass, right? Not always, depends on how you train, concentric versus eccentric, et cetera, et cetera. But we're really splitting hairs here. It really comes down to proper signaling and insulin response. Now, the reason that the carbohydrate group might have had a shorter term increase in muscle was because, yes, they had insulin signaling that was allowing the muscle to draw in carbohydrates and draw in protein more. Okay, and because carbohydrates were present and it was only a 10-week study, perhaps you had more carbohydrates getting sucked into the muscle, which makes the muscle fuller, which on any kind of DEXA scan or anything like that is going to demonstrate as more lean mass because you have more literal lean mass because it's volumized with water. So the strength and the power increases demonstrate that the actual protein synthesis was probably close to the same. But let's kind of back up again because IGF is not something that we have elevated all the time. Why would we want IGF elevated all the time? That would be meaning that we are constantly turning on growth signals. Now, if you have any experience with IGF, also know that IGF doesn't just grow muscle tissue, it can grow organs, it can grow all kinds of things. We don't want it chronically elevated. We want periodic, quick spikes. So can you build muscle without carbohydrates? Yes, you can via different pathways. Testosterone and dihydrate testosterone, more affinity for the androgen receptor is definitely a better way, and less leptin, okay, which I'll talk about in a second, definitely allows you to. But I will go ahead and cut to the chase right here and tell you that all you need is an acute insulin spike. Okay, an acute insulin spike at the right time, post-workout, or strategically placed. So you can still have 20, 30 grams of carbohydrates after a workout to stimulate that IGF response that's at least going to stimulate recovery. That's how you get the best of both worlds. It's called carb backloading, where you are following a ketogenic protocol, where you're getting potentially more testosterone, where you're potentially getting the equal strength and power outcomes while also having lower levels of fat, but then you're also spiking your insulin with some carbohydrates right after a workout, allowing IGF and insulin to spike, turning on those growth signals for the right amount of time. Now, let me also explain why the study that I mentioned earlier plays such a role in terms of the quality muscle we put on later on. If we are able to lose fat and build muscle relatively at the same time, not the literal same time, but over the course of the same 10-week period per se, that means that we are reducing some fat mass while building muscle. That means that we have less estrogenic aromatase enzyme in our fat, because less fat means less aromatase enzyme. The more fat we have, the more estrogen converting aromatase we have. So if we were to just build a bunch of muscle with just a bunch of carbohydrates like this study, I'm not saying that that's not the way to do it. You absolutely can, but you run a potential risk of being more estrogenic, okay? Of increasing the affinity of the estrogen receptor beta. I'm not saying that one is going to be better than the other, because I do think that if you have some carbohydrates, you might be able to put on muscle mass a little bit faster, which allows you more time to cut the fat off strategically. But if you were trying to stay lean and build muscle at the same time, it might be better to do it in a ketogenic lower carb fashion, because then you're not putting on the fat, which aromatizes testosterone, converting it into estrogen. Now, another piece I have to touch on, which is really important, is leptin. We only think of leptin as a cheat meal hormone, and I've talked about this in countless videos, probably drive people crazy with it, but let me just touch on it for a second. Okay, leptin is what sends a signal to our brain that says, hey, this person is healthy and hearty and full of food, so feel free to go ahead and signal the production of reproductive hormones, because they are good to procreate, because they're healthy and they are ready to go, okay? What happens is when we have a lot of fat on us, we create a bunch of leptin, and too much leptin ends up causing this leptin interference, this leptin resistance. There's a study that was published in the journal Lipids that took a look at a lower carb protocol versus a standard lower fat, I won't call it lower fat, but more Western protocol, both relatively healthy diets, just, macros were different, okay, calories were the same. They found that, yes, insulin levels were lower in the keto group, but leptin levels, there was a 42% drop compared to an 18% drop. So the lower carb ketogenic group dropped leptin levels more. The reason that it did that is because, well, now you were able to increase the leptin sensitivity, so the leptin that was being released was actually able to hit the signal receptor properly, triggering luteinizing hormone pulses from the pituitary gland to actually spike, causing more surge in testosterone. So that's all related to testosterone, which I'll be the first to say, and I've done content surrounding it. I don't believe that your plasma levels of testosterone dictate how much muscle you build. I think they play a role, but I think it's what's actually hitting the target, what's actually hitting the receptor, and what's actually hitting the muscle and triggering growth. So yes, that's important, but I do think that if we have better leptin signaling, we can have better insulin responses, we can have more acute short-term responses the way that we would want. So no, you're not going to have a strategic spike of IGF-1 without carbohydrates, but you are going to have a different metabolic drive that is going to potentially allow you to build a higher quality muscle while maintaining your leanness. So are carbs critical for muscle? Kind of, but at the end of the day, you can just be smart with when you do it. So as always, keep it locked in here on my channel, and I'll see you tomorrow.